Hi, I'm Ryan, and this time I'm talking to you about the apostrophe, which looks like that. The apostrophe is probably one of the hardest punctuation marks to use, and that's because it doesn't like to be consistent about what it does. Basically, the apostrophe has a few main uses, probably three. The first is to show ownership, and that's probably the trickiest. The second is to show missing letters, the most notable instance of which is a contraction. So if you've cut letters out of a word, just a few letters, then you'll throw an apostrophe in there to show that something's missing. And the third instance, which is very rare, is a pluralization of words that aren't typically words in the English language. So I'll go through all those three. The most common use of the apostrophe is to show ownership. So Ryan's jumper. That's where you put an apostrophe at the end of my name and before an S to show that the jumper belongs to me. The problem is that if you remove that apostrophe and you say Ryan's jumper, what you're actually saying is multiple Ryan's jumper, which doesn't make sense. The jumper doesn't belong to me. You're just saying lots of Ryan's jumper. So that can get a bit confusing, and that's why the apostrophe is necessary. But if we say Ryan's jumpers, it'll be Ryan apostrophe S jumpers, with no apostrophe there, because that's a plural, and we won't use an apostrophe after jumpers. Now, unfortunately, ownership gets even trickier, because if the name ends in S, the apostrophe has to come after the S, and you don't even necessarily put an S after the apostrophe. So let's say we're talking about James's jumper instead. Even though you can hear me say James's with an extra S in there, we write James apostrophe, and then we don't need to put anything there before we say jumper. Now, if you find it easier, put an S after the apostrophe anyway. There's nothing wrong with doing that, and it can be easy to remember that you always put an S after an apostrophe of ownership. So James's jumper can be written James apostrophe S jumper. It might look a little odd with the two S's there, but it's still technically correct, so you're fine. Now, one way you may see a common mistake here is on fruit signs. This is for some reason something that commonly goes wrong. People will talk about $5 apples, $6 bananas. But you can hear there that what we're talking about are plurals. It's $5 for multiple apples, it's $5 for multiple bananas. So you don't need to put an apostrophe there because it's pluralization. Now, the problem is that I haven't even got to the most confusing part yet. So far, I've been talking about apostrophes as ownership, but there's one word that makes this really, really difficult, and that's its. And its. There are two forms of this word, it apostrophe S and its, with no apostrophe. And this is going to run into what I'm about to talk about now, which is apostrophes for contractions, and then I'll come back to its because that's a problematic word. So the apostrophe can also be used to show the omission of letters. So a common example is didn't. We have D-I-D-N apostrophe T. Now what this is showing is that we're actually missing a letter here because didn't separates into did not. So we have did not. But in common language, we pronounce that really quickly as didn't. So we shorten the word, we cut out the O, and we put an apostrophe there to show that we've cut it out. That's another way to use this. When we have its with an apostrophe, what the apostrophe here is actually showing is that we're missing a letter because it extends to it is. So we're missing the I. And that's when you use its with an apostrophe. So it's really cold in Ballarat would have an apostrophe in it because that extends to it is really cold in Ballarat. But if we wanted to say something like the dog lost its ball, we write it without an apostrophe. And that's because in this instance, the word ITS is actually to show ownership. So the dog lost its ball is written without an apostrophe, and that way we know the ball belongs to the dog. Now I know this goes against everything I've said previously about ownership because I was telling you to put apostrophes in there, but for its, we don't do that, and that's where it gets confusing. So just remember, if you put the apostrophe in there, you need to be able to say it is. So try pronouncing it that way. If you put it is with an apostrophe, say the whole sentence with it is in place, and if it doesn't make sense, you know you shouldn't have the apostrophe there. Now the third use for apostrophes is very rare, and you probably don't need to worry about this one too much, but I want to go over it in case. And that's to mark the pluralization of words that aren't typically made plurals, or aren't typically words, sorry. So, for instance, you need to dot your I's and cross your T's. That's a saying that is often heard. But some people will write it, you need to dot your I''S and cross your T''S. Now, I don't like to do that because it can be a bit confusing, mainly because, as we've said previously, apostrophes are typically used to show ownership or missing letters, and that's doing neither of these things in this instance. Instead, it can be easier to either italicize the words that aren't typically words or put them in single quotation marks. So dot your I's and cross your T's. You might italicize the I and T, but not the S. Or you might put them in marks, which can be an easier way to do it. And that way you don't need to try and remember to use an apostrophe there as well. So in short, apostrophes are used for ownership and to show missing letters, except for the case of its, where it's used to show missing letters but not ownership. So just try and keep that in mind, and hopefully this video will help to make it easier.